Is Switch going to break the traditional hardware pattern and turn the Nintendo Switch into the next iPhone, Samsung Galaxy, smartphone device, not inherently with yearly updates, but with something akin to never having to exactly reset the generational audience? Apparently, there are some very professional people out there that feel Nintendo is going to do just that. But before we get into it, I got to remind you, we have a couple giveaways going on. The first for a Nintendo Switch, a PlayStation 5, or an Xbox Series X. The other for 2 copies of Pikmin 3 Deluxe. To find out how to enter, head down into the description. We're also on our road to 100,000 subscribers, and if we can get 100K before the end of this year, well, hey, you know what? You can just expect a massive giveaway in January with over $1,000 worth of stuff given out. Also, hey, YouTube can really suck sometimes, and because of that, we are now going to be streaming over on Twitch. We're also going to be having all of our videos re-uploaded over to BitChute, so links to those down in the description as well if you would like some alternative ways to enjoy my content. All right, let's get into this. So some analysts out there are very high on Nintendo Switch in terms of what they're going to do, because with Switch being in the middle of its generation, the concern starts to come up now as we start to approach next gen territory that Nintendo is about to reset their audience, similarly to how PlayStation and Xbox are resetting their audience with the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5. And this has traditionally been how things are done. You went from Wii to Wii U to Switch, PlayStation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Same with the Xbox as well, with the Xbox 360, the Xbox One, and now the Xbox Series X. And while there's been mid-gen refreshes for a lot of these platforms, and there is reportedly rumored to be a mid-gen refresh in the works for Nintendo Switch coming next year, that doesn't have anything to do with what their next platform is going to be. Nintendo has traditionally been very unpredictable. Now, it's notably that this unpredictableness all came under the guidance of Satoru Iwata, the late Satoru Iwata. Rest in peace, my man. He was the one that pushed Nintendo into the Wii era, taking them off of Nintendo's traditional console route, which, what was pretty much pretty standard fare. He pushed the Wii and DS stuff. You got to remember, before that, Nintendo was very much in the power race with everybody else. Nintendo was very much doing traditional handheld upgrades like, other competitors tried to do, but failed. So Nintendo continued to boom with the handheld business, doing a more traditional path, and obviously the console business started going like this. But the thought process here is that obviously there is Shintaro Furukawa in charge, who is much more business savvy, like prior presidents were before Satoru Iwata. Satoru Iwata was much more of a game developer type, whereas before him, all the other CEOs and presidents of Nintendo were much more business focused. And the thing is that Shintaro Furukawa likely sees a path here where Nintendo can keep making iterative systems like the Switch, but better for many years to come without having to reset the audience. Now, I've talked about Nintendo doing this years ago. It was like, you know what? The Switch is like that perfect platform that if nobody rains on your parade, if nobody invades the space that you're doing, why would you stop doing it when there's clearly a massive place in the market for a system that you can take on the go and play on your TV via a dock? Like, there's no reason to stop doing it when there's no major competitor that's successful at it. And obviously we see that with PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S, and even with streaming services, that Microsoft and Sony are going in a completely different direction than Nintendo is. So why end the Switch lifecycle with another kooky out there idea that might take off, but also would just abandon an audience that has no replacement for what the Switch currently does? So the thought process out there now by some professional analysts talking to Bloomberg is that with every console generation, this comes from Tone, who's an investment manager at 10 West Advisors. He says with every console generation, the install base resets to zero and their earning power essentially resets to zero. They can continuously have an install base of, say, 100 million consoles per year that just moves along over time. So the idea is you have the Switch Pro and then, or whatever they call it, and then you have the next gen Switch. So what you do is you have everything backwards compatible over with the Switch Pro and the regular Switch, and then when you have that next gen Switch come, everything is backwards compatible, through all the Switch generations. But new games on the next gen Switch that comes in like 2023, 2024, would only be backwards compatible with that Switch Pro, not the original Switch, and so on and so forth. So mid-gen refresh. Basically, every 3 years, you can end up getting a new Switch that's back compat with the old Switch, but not the Switch that's the gen before. So you can keep moving technology and keep moving games forward while not completely abandoning your base, keeping a rolling 100 million install base. This is exactly what phones have been doing for, a decade at least. So I think that this is actually a brilliant strategy, and I'm not the only one, because another investment person, Ryan O'Connor, a manager of the Kansas City-based investment firm Crossroads Capital, agrees with Tram and says Nintendo's gotten a lot wiser over the last few years, and he told Bloomberg that Nintendo of today is just different from the company that existed pre-2017, and he feels the Japanese firm has given enough indication that it's looking to establish a perpetual platform rather than kickstart a new hardware cycle with this next system. And this, to me, is a brilliant strategy. If you think about what Shintaro Furukawa most recently said about the next Switch or the next gen platform or whatever, that Nintendo is working on cutting edge technology that needs to have a 5 to 6 hour battery life. So they're still looking at a battery based system that's using cutting edge tech, and they have that 10-year partnership with NVIDIA. So it seems to me that they're not just talking about the Switch Pro, they're talking about what's after the Switch Pro. They're talking about doing this for at least another decade. Remember, they talked about the Switch as a family of systems, and it technically is, because we have the Switch Lite and we have the normal Nintendo Switch and the version 2 Nintendo Switch. Yes, and now maybe the new Switch next year. So it's still a family of systems. But why does that family have to stop? Why does Nintendo have to abandon an audience that's clearly in high demand? Look at how well Nintendo's games are selling. Like, Nintendo has some of their games selling better right now than they've ever sold in the history of the company. This is even including the Nintendo DS, 150 plus million selling system, and the Nintendo Wii, which is the only home console to date Nintendo has that has cracked 100 million units. Yet Game Software today is blowing up on Switch for Nintendo in a way they have never seen, even beating out the Wii days for certain software titles. We're not at Wii Sports levels, of course, but certain software titles, the Marios, the Zeldas, probably Pikmin 3 Deluxe, the Mario Parties are all doing bigger numbers than Nintendo's biggest era ever. So it comes reason to think that Nintendo shouldn't abandon a place in the market that nobody else really exists in. Yes, there's the GDP Win 2 out there, which is a Windows portable gaming platform. Like, there are competitors that exist, including smartphones. But you know what? None of them are doing what Nintendo is doing in the gaming space specifically. So, honestly, this to me seems like the obvious thing for Nintendo to do. Nintendo would be stupid as a business to abandon an audience that nobody else serves. See, when the Wii hit its 100 million and we got towards the end of that life cycle, we had reached a point where there were motion controls in the Xbox 360, there were smartphones now, and obviously motion controls on the PlayStation 3. And the thing is, a lot of consumers had kind of moved on from Wii to playing those kind of games on their phone, the more casual games on their phone. Even Just Dance you could play on your phone at the time. You could also play a lot of these motion control games on systems that were in HD. But by the time 2012 came around, a lot of people already had HD platforms. So then when they brought out the Wii U, obviously we could talk about all that, why that flopped. But the point is that the audience that played Wii kind of was gone by the end of the Wii's generation, because there were other platforms and other ways to enjoy games that kind of replaced what the Wii did. Well, there's nothing right now replacing what the Switch does. Nothing even on the horizon replacing what the Switch does. Nintendo is working in its own market that nobody else is serving. The closest is streaming services. And even then, Streaming services require internet connections. They require stable internet connections. You can't play it everywhere. There's no seamlessness. Like, you can't take your Switch from playing in the house into the car and just seamlessly keep playing your game because it requires an online connection. Like, it's not a smooth experience, or as smooth as playing locally. And they still use cartridges, so you don't have to do big game installs. So yes, well, it would be nice to have a bigger internal memory. You can get away with not having a bigger internal memory as long as you buy certain games and avoid other games that take up more, like NBA 2K. That series obviously takes up a massive amount of your internal memory because only part of the game's on the cartridge. It's just, honestly, Nintendo has an ace in the hole that can keep giving and giving and giving until somebody else tries to invade in their space. And right now, the major platform holders have zero interest in invading in Nintendo's handheld / dockable, territory. Nintendo can have this all to themselves. And mobile technology has come to a point that Nintendo can even technically compete with these next-gen platforms with much less powerful hardware thanks to hardware advances in technology, such as deep learning super sampling. We've talked about that before. So, yes, Nintendo is sitting pretty, and there's no reason to assume that Nintendo is going to change course with a very different president at the head, a more business-oriented president, and who's already admitted they're working on cutting-edge technology with better battery life. So we already have that coming from the president. And in addition to all of that, all this craziness, all this wonkiness that happened with Nintendo and these massively different platforms and all that happened under a president that's no longer there. Nintendo is not going to just abandon what's making them successful now when it's happening at a rate that they haven't seen in certain regards, and it's happening where there's no one else to even replace what they're doing. Nintendo abandoning the Switch audience and doing something wacky and totally different would be, to be frank, asinine. Because there's nothing else to sweep in and replace the Switch from anywhere else. So, I agree with these analysts. I made this prediction years ago. I think we're going to see part of this prediction come true next year with a mid-gen upgrade. And I feel like when the true next-gen Switch hits in a few years, you're going to see that Nintendo is realizing the same thing that I am realizing and other analysts are realizing, and that's that Nintendo's onto something where they can now smartphone the market, and gamers are going to love it, as long as it's not a yearly upgrade. I think gamers would be pretty perturbed if they had to buy a new Switch every year, but every few years, every 4, every 3, that's pretty acceptable in today's gaming landscape. All right, folks, I'm Nathaniel Robochance from Nintendo Prime. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know what you think about this down in the comments below, and I'll catch each and every one of you in the next video.